I want to welcome you all and welcome to those of you who were here last week. I welcome you again, and to those who missed last week, I welcome you to for the first time to our Local Luminaries talk series that we have set up for you, the most generous and faithful supporters of the Newport Beach Public Library Foundation. My name is Karen Clark, and I am the chair of the foundation. As you likely know, for the past 30 years, the foundation has supported the library with cash gifts for special library items not included in the city funding, and a variety of high quality programs and lectures. If not for your generous support, most of these library enhancements and programs would not exist. So thank you very much. 2020, a strange and terrible year. The pandemic has thrown everything out of kilter for everyone. And unfortunately, we have not been able to honor you donors with our normal special in-person programs and donor receptions. So to make sure that you know how much you're appreciated, we've put together the speaker series of truly extraordinary UCI professors. This is a series open only to you, our most generous donors, as a way to again say thank you for your support. So tonight's the second in our series of 3 lectures. We heard from Professor Michelle Goodwin last week, and next week we'll hear from Professor Elizabeth Loftus. Tonight we're going to hear from an election law expert, Rick Hasen, about the pitfalls and perils of the upcoming election. Now, we managed, unfortunately, to schedule our final 2 lectures on the same night as the presidential debates. We lucked out a little tonight because Trump decided he was not going to debate, so we did not have to change our time. It seems at this point that next week's debate is likely to go on, so stay tuned. Most likely we will switch to Wednesday night rather than Thursday night next week for our final debate, so that we do not conflict. I mean, the final talk, so we do not conflict with the presidential debate. But we'll let you know. So before we start, I want to point you to the question and answer button that should be on the bottom of your Zoom screen. It says Q&A. So we hope that you will click on that and you can type in any questions that you have. And at the end of the program, there will be a Q&A session and your questions will be answered. So now I'd like to introduce my fellow foundation board member, Afsani Al-Sabani, who is a prominent local psychotherapist, and her daughter Nasim, who was the real connection that enabled us to entice Professor Hasen to speak to us tonight. As it turns out, Professor Hasen was Nasim's professor and mentor at UCI Law School. And as a fun aside, Nasim and her now husband actually met at the Newport Beach Public Library. We at the foundation found their story so charming that we featured them in our foundation publication known as the Bookmark. So Afsani and Nasim will introduce our main speaker, Professor Rick Hasen, and his interviewer, Professor Henry Weinstein. Okay, Afsani.
Hello, everybody, and I'm really happy to be here. And thank you, Karen, for your introduction. And I too want to thank all of you for supporting the Newport Beach Public Library Foundation, and I'm grateful to you all. And I have followed Rick's work with regard to elections for years. I think actually since Bush v. Gore in 2000, and as well as Henry's reporting in Los Angeles Times. So I'm very excited to be here tonight and hear a conversation between Henry and Rick about the upcoming election. But I thought, and I made the suggestion to Karen that I think it would be much more appropriate, and I'm sure Henry and Rick would prefer to hear from their student introducing them than me. So with that, I'd like to give the mic to Nasim, who's going to give you a little, tell you a little bit about both Rick and Henry's uh, background. And Henry and Rick, thank you so much for generously giving this time to us. We do realize that you guys are really busy and in very high demand, especially during these last weeks to the election. So we really appreciate it, and thank you very much for giving this time with us. Thank you. That's
Okay.
it.
Thank you, Karen, and thanks, Mom, for that wonderful introduction. So, Richard Hasen is a Chancellor's Professor of Law and Political Science at UCI. He is a nationally recognized election law and campaign finance expert. He's a prolific writer who's written hundreds of articles for both legal professionals and the general public on various election-related topics. He's written multiple books. One was literally the book on election law. And he's also written books from topics ranging from Bush v. Gore to Antonin Scalia. His most recent book, published in 2020, American Election Meltdown, Dirty Tricks, Distrust, and the Threat to American Democracy, is a must-read for anyone who wants keen analysis on the stressors that are on our voting system today. You can find his other work featured on Slate, Politico, New York Times, and CNN. He also runs the Election Law blog, which is an invaluable resource to anyone who's looking for election-related coverage. His other work at UCI focuses on legislative and statutory interpretation, the Supreme Court, torts, and remedies. He is part of the American Law Institute and a reporter for the Third Restatement of Torts, Remedies. He holds his BA from Cal Berkeley and a JD, MA, and PhD from UCLA. Henry Weinstein is also another UCI law professor and another one of my professors as well. He is an award-winning journalist with multiple publications like the LA Times, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and San Francisco Examiner. He's written over 3,000 articles covering legal affairs, politics, and other important issues. He's been part of the team that's won 2 Pulitzer Prizes with the LA Times, one for his coverage of the LA riots in 1993, and another for the Northridge earthquake in 1995. He's also won the LA Times editorial award twice, once for his coverage of Bush v. Gore and another for the O.J. Simpson case. Henry, I turn it over to you.
Nasim, thank you very much for that warm introduction. Thank you. And I'd like to thank the members of the foundation for putting on this program and for all the work that you do on behalf of the public library, which is about a 10-minute drive from my condo in Irvine. Public libraries are, as far as I'm concerned, one of the cornerstones of a democratic society, as is voting, the subject of tonight's program. This is the 4th one I've done with Rick this year, and I suspect it may not be the last. When we did our first one, I think it was in February, it was right after the problems with the Iowa caucuses. So much has happened since then, it seems like the Pleistocene age. I'm confident, though, that there's one thing that Rick and I could not overstate tonight. We may say it more than once, and that's quite simply the importance of the right to vote. The right to vote, as far as I'm concerned, is the most fundamental right in this country because it provides a gateway to all other rights. If you don't have a vote, you don't have a voice in a democratic society. And as I'm sure most of the audience knows, in this country, people were murdered trying to secure the right to vote. This morning, I drove about 10 minutes from my condo in Irvine, parked my car at a senior center in Irvine, put on my mask, walked out of the car, and walked over to one of the literally dozens of official drop boxes in Orange County and cast my ballot. It could not have been easier. But in a lot of places in this country, it's not nearly that easy. Rick, politicians and judges talk a lot about the importance of voting, but they often put impediments in front of voters. If voters is our most important right, why are people having to stand in line for 10 hours to vote?
It's a great question, Henry. Before I answer it, let me just also express my appreciation for the work that the library does, and I'm glad to be with you. This is my third event today. I've been saying no to a lot of events, but I have a soft spot for libraries, a softer spot for Michelle Goodwin, who made the introduction, and the softest spot for Nassim, who was not only one of my star students, but also my research assistant on, I believe it was working on the book on Justice Scalia. So it's just very good to see Nassim again, and happy to be with you all. So to the question, why 10 hours to vote? Well, if we ask that question about Georgia, where people indeed waited 10 or 12 hours to vote in the last few days, immediately Democrats jumped to the conclusion that this was deliberate voter suppression. And immediately Republicans said, no, it's just a lot of high demand. As the lines got somewhat better the second day, but still were quite long, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution published a story that said that really one of the main drivers of the problems in Georgia in the last few days was the fact that there was a bottleneck. So when you go to vote in Georgia in person early, they check you in on a little iPad, an electronic poll book, and that poll book has to communicate with a server that maintains the list of all the voters in the state. And it couldn't handle the capacity. Lots of times when we see things that look like voter suppression or that look like fraud, it turns out to be administrative incompetence. That's one of the themes of my book. It is no less aggravating to have to wait online for 12 hours because you are subject to a poor election system, but it's perhaps a little comforting to know that it was not necessarily deliberate. So why are we in this mess? If we compare ourselves to every other advanced democracy in the every other advanced democracy in the world, the United States is alone in having decentralized election administration at this level. So if you go to Australia, Canada, Germany, you pick your advanced democracy, they've got a national nonpartisan election system. When you go to vote in one part of the country, the machinery is the same, the rules are the same. Even during a pandemic, South Korea was able to run a very successful election, even as the pandemic was raging. There were no lawsuits, there was no controversy. Here, we have a decentralized system. We have something like 10,500 different election systems, election jurisdictions in the country. We have authority split between state, federal, and local authorities. We don't have adequate resources. We allow partisans to run elections, people whose allegiance is to the Democratic or Republican Party, first and foremost, rather than to the having a system with the most integrity. And we have a constitution that does not affirmatively protect the right to vote. Again, look at other modern democracies. Their constitutions are not as old as ours. A lot of those democracies affirmatively recognize the right to vote. What do we have in our constitution? If you're going to hold a vote, you can't discriminate on the basis of race or gender or age over 18. We don't have a positive right to vote. You put this all together in this polarized atmosphere, and you add on top of it a pandemic. Well, what does that lead to? We've got over 300 lawsuits, including now, I think, about a half a dozen emergency lawsuits pending at the United States Supreme Court over what the rules should be. At issue, and then I'll stop here and turn it back to you, Henry. At issue is kind of two visions of how we should think about voting in the middle of a pandemic. One vision, the more conservative vision, is that we should defer to the states and allow them to figure out what the rules are going to be for running a safe election in a pandemic, even if that means that some voters may get disenfranchised. And we shouldn't make changes to rules very close to the election. On the other hand, the more liberal view is it's a pandemic. It's really hard for people to vote. Requirements like getting a witness to sign that they've seen you fill out your ballot, or requiring people to vote in a short time frame. These things can be a burden on the right to vote during a pandemic in a way that they wouldn't necessarily be otherwise. And so we have a lot of disputes where the parties are dividing. There have been suits over drop boxes. We've got a big issue about, you mentioned drop boxes, a big issue about unofficial drop boxes being put out by the state Republican Party in Orange County, and it's just a mess. And you had on top of that a president who is making wildly unsubstantiated claims about fraud and claiming just about every day that if he doesn't win the election, it's because the election is rigged or stolen. And that undermines people's confidence in the process. So there's no single one answer to your question, but it's a confluence of a number of factors, all of which are contributing to a society where the act of voting itself is one of the most important issues in the election. Right? It's not just the background rule, it's up there with the coronavirus and up there with the economy. We're talking about voting itself as a campaign question.
Thank you, Rick. I guess I'll ask a slightly leading question coming off of that is whether or not we're sort of resistant to learning. 20 years ago, when you and I were sort of joined at the hip for weeks and weeks and weeks during the Bush versus Gore period, the nation got a stark wake-up call. The word hanging chads became part of the lexicon. And everybody said, boy, we've got to fix this stuff. But just late this afternoon, early this evening, there's a long story in the Washington Post about how somebody's ballot may be disqualified because they can't navigate bad ballot design. Seems like we're just not making much progress.
So if you think back to the 2000 election and those hanging chads, there were a lot of problems with how that election was run. One of them, which you've alluded to, was voting technology. And generally speaking, technology has improved in the United States since 2000. So we estimate that about 1 million fewer people become disenfranchised because of bad technology. I mean, there were millions of people. Now 1 million fewer people are disenfranchised because of bad technology. We got rid of those punch card machines. We got rid of those lever machines, which I remember going with my parents in New York when I was a kid, go behind the curtain, push the levers, open the curtain, it records the vote. Those machines were also quite inaccurate. People could go back and turn the numbers. So that's gone. We've improved voting technology. At one point, a number of states did fully electronic voting machines. That raised new problems of hacking. And a lot of those machines are on their way out, but we still have questions about those machines. But things are generally better. But because we're in a pandemic, the number of people who are going to be voting by mail for the first time is going to be dramatically increased. So just to give you some numbers, in Georgia in 2016, in the primary, 36,000 people approximately voted by mail. And in the primary in 2020, it was 1.2 million. And first-time voters are more likely to be disenfranchised because they don't necessarily follow the rules. We had a ruling from the state Supreme Court in Pennsylvania that said that if you don't put your ballot in the inner envelope there was 2 envelopes, an outer envelope and an inner envelope. If you don't put it in the inner envelope, it's considered a naked ballot and it won't be counted. We know that about 100,000 people didn't have their ballots counted in the primary because their ballots were naked. So now there's a whole public service campaign going on to try to tell people to clothe their ballots. It takes time to educate voters. There are 5 states that do primarily voting by mail. California is now joining them in this election, as are 3 other states. But it takes time. It takes years to develop those systems. So some of it is about capacity. So some of the story is our technology is better, but in a pandemic, we're taking 2 steps back because rolling out massive mail-in voting in the middle of a pandemic is a really hard thing to do. I'm especially worried about states like Pennsylvania and Michigan, where they don't have a great history of election administration and they're having millions of people vote by mail for the first time. So part of the story is that. Part of the story is also a story of partisanship. One of the lessons that political operatives learned in Bush versus Gore was that the rules of the game really matter. And when the margins are close, it makes a difference whether or not it's easy or hard to register, whether or not you have to show a form of voter identification, whether or not you have a long period before that you must register before you're allowed to vote. These rules have been manipulated by political operatives, and part of it, I think, reflects the current political positions of the 2 major political parties. Democrats have made a calculation that The easier we make it to register and vote, the more successful they're going to be, because first-time voters, newer voters, the voters who are poor, minority voters, people who've moved are more likely to vote for Democrats. And so they've been siding with voting rights groups and trying to make it easier for people to vote. Republicans had a choice. You may remember after Mitt Romney lost in 2012, the Republican Party to Barack Obama for president, the Republican Party did what they called an autopsy, figure out what they need to do to improve the party's chances. And they issued a report and said, we need to make a bigger tent. We need to be a more inclusive party. We need to appeal to minority voters, younger voters, more appeal to women, et cetera. That wing of the party lost out as Trump became president. And the appeal now is to a whiter, more rural, older demographic. And making it harder to vote is seen as a way of trying to help Trump win. And you add on top of that the Electoral College. I mean, it's amazing that the Trump campaign is not even trying to win the popular vote. The popular vote is a beauty contest, right? It doesn't matter for the outcome. It might matter for the legitimacy, but we go by Electoral College votes. Everyone's predicting that Trump will lose the popular vote by millions, whether or not he wins the actual presidency. And so the political parties are lined up in this kind of dynamic where one party has an interest in supporting broader voting rights, and the other party has an interest in supporting narrower voting rights. And this gets reflected not just in partisan politics, but in ideology, as I mentioned. The conservative judges on the courts, especially on the Supreme Court, were appointed by Republican presidents for not because they're necessarily trying to help their party in a crass way, but ideologically, their jurisprudential views line up with the idea of giving states lots of deference and letting them cut back on voting rights. And so you end up with, we saw this whole series of cases where lower courts were saying, all right, let's throw out the notarization requirement in Oklahoma. Let's make it easier for people to vote by mail in Texas. And Texas is one of the few states where you still need an excuse to vote by mail. And the Texas Supreme Court said, it's not a disability if you are, if you have no immunity to coronavirus and you don't want to show up. What we're seeing is the courts dividing on these questions. And you add on top of that all of the other problems of voting in a pandemic. And you know, we're here 20 years after Bush versus Gore, and I can't say I'm more confident about the election. I'm going to say I'm less confident about how the election is going to go.
So earlier you referred to sort of two competing themes, the themes of advocated by Republicans of voter fraud and of Democrats of voter suppression. What's the evidence of either of those things?
That's a great question. Lots of laws that have been passed almost exclusively by Republican legislatures that make it harder to register and vote have been justified on two grounds, either that they prevent fraud or that they promote voter confidence. The evidence is that the amount of voter fraud in this country is quite low. It's not as though you can't find cases. You can find cases. There are occasional cases. We had a couple of notorious cases involving absentee ballots in the last few years. I'll talk about both of those. One was North Carolina, where a political operative was working for a Republican candidate for the 9th Congressional District, collected absentee ballots against state law and has been charged with tampering with them, changing the votes or destroying ballots. We also saw in Paterson, New Jersey, just this year, an all-male election. The president has talked about this a lot. Democratic city. So this one benefits Democrats, but the other ones benefit Republicans, where it looked like about 800 ballots were tampered with, including taking ballots and voting them for other people. It can happen. It turns out to be quite rare. If you look at the statistics on voter fraud prosecutions, you look at the evidence, what you see is almost every voter fraud prosecution does not look like what I've just described, which is a kind of organized effort to change vote outcomes. Instead, it looks like there was just a case last month in Los Angeles about a guy whose mother died. He didn't report it to authorities to take her off the voting rolls, and he voted her ballot 3 times. It's a crime. He should be prosecuted for it, but that's not changing the outcome of elections. And lots of what counts as election crimes turn out to be inadvertent mistakes by voters. People who, for example, we have a case of a woman who went to jail for 5 years who was on parole and thought that once she was out of jail, she was allowed to vote. But that was a felony in Texas. And so she's now in jail for 5 years. All right, so lots of what looks like mistakes get done as fraud. So voter fraud is quite rare. It's slightly more likely to happen with absentee ballots than otherwise, but it's rare. Well, what about voter suppression? I think there's no question in my mind, and I make this point in chapter 1 of Election Meltdown, that the intent of passing some of these laws is to make it harder for people to register and to vote, because there's no evidence not only of massive fraud. Lots of these laws are not aimed at stopping a lot of fraud, like voter ID laws would stop people from impersonating others at the polling place, and that really does not happen on any scale at all. It's kind of the least common kind of fraud. Or voter confidence, and there's no good evidence that states with stricter voting laws have higher voter confidence. But are they suppressing a lot of the vote? Well, I think the answer is probably not that much so far. For example, the studies of voter identification laws don't tend to show that they suppress a lot of votes, in part because they provoke a reaction where you go out and you find the people who want to vote, and you spend all this effort that you could have been spending on campaigning, making sure people get their IDs. But there are some exceptions where I think these laws can have a major effect, and I'll just talk about one of them. In Kansas passed a law that said if you want to register to vote, you have to provide documentary proof of citizenship. That is, you have to provide a birth certificate or a naturalization certificate. And this law was challenged as violating federal law. And we know that by the time that the federal district court in Kansas put that law on hold, 30,000 people were disenfranchised. So very significant number of people. The case went to trial after a whole bunch of pretrial appeals and things. And the question was, is there a lot of non-citizen fraud that would justify such a draconian law that would disenfranchise 30,000 people? Chris Kobach, who was the Secretary of State of Kansas, who claimed that there was a lot of fraud, he had a chance to prove it. He said what he proved was the tip of the iceberg. And the federal district court judge, a fourth-generation Kansan Republican judge, she said, there is no iceberg. There's only an icicle made up of administrative error. So not a whole bunch of proof of either, but I'm much more concerned about the suppression than the fraud in terms of what we're seeing right now.
Thank you, Rick. So you said that there were already, literally hundreds of lawsuits filed this year related to election, and that there's probably a half a dozen, coming up potentially the Supreme Court. Which ones do you think are the most important, and do you have any sense about the outcomes?
Yeah, just to be clear, there are, I think, a half a dozen cases pending right now at the Supreme Court.
Right.
And more to come. There were two cases that have already been decided, and one that we're waiting on that I think are the most important in any pre-election litigation. If the election's so close that it goes to post-election litigation like Bush versus Gore, then that obviously would be the most important one. But the two cases have already been decided. One came out of Wisconsin after the primary, or just before the primary, I should say, in April, and one just came out last week out of South Carolina. And both of them were about can federal courts order easing of voting rules in the midst of the pandemic in order to protect people's constitutional rights? And the Supreme Court in both of those cases said no. In the Wisconsin case, the court divided 5-4 along ideological lines and said, what's going on here is not enough deference to the states, and we're going to roll back the extension of the deadline for receiving absentee ballots, even though there was evidence that a lot of people are going to be disenfranchised because the state could not process and the Postal Service could not process all of the absentee ballot requests in time to get people to vote on time. That's why there's such a push for early voting this time around to avoid those kind of problems. Similar case in South Carolina, and this is the one I mentioned earlier, where the South Carolina court had in the primary and then in the general said, you don't need a witness signature if you're voting by mail in the middle of the pandemic. In the primary, it wasn't challenged, but in the general election, it was challenged. The federal district court said, no, we still need to keep it in place. But the US Supreme Court reversed and said two things. Number one, defer to the states as to what's necessary to deal with elections during a pandemic, which strikes me as a little odd since the people who run the state are the ones who are up for election. Maybe they shouldn't be the ones who are making the rules without court supervision. The other thing that Justice Kavanaugh said in his concurring opinion in that order was you can't make changes too close to the election because that can confuse voters and can make it harder for election administrators. The irony of that statement is that the election had already started in South Carolina. People were already voting. The instruction said you don't need a witness signature. And then the Supreme Court said, okay, beginning 2 days from now, despite what it says, you do need a witness signature. So I'm guessing there's going to be a lot of people who are going to be disenfranchised by the court's determination that to prevent confusion, they needed to roll back this rule. So those are the two cases that have already been decided. The other one that I'm watching really closely, the one that looks slightly different, and this gets a little bit in the weeds, but I think it's worth explaining because it's important. Pennsylvania has a Republican legislature, a Democratic governor, and a Democratic-dominated Supreme Court. So Democrats went to the state Supreme Court and said, can you ease some of the voting rules because we're in the middle of a pandemic? And they argued you should do that in reliance on not the federal constitution, but the state constitution. State constitution of Pennsylvania says something like, we should have free and fair elections. So the state Supreme Court said, yes, we're going to ease some of these rules, including we're going to say, if a ballot comes in within 3 days of the election, either postmarked by election day or without a postmark at all, it should be counted. Republicans have now challenged that in the US Supreme Court. And they've made two arguments. Number one, under the elections clause of the Constitution, we have one election day, and this is extending the election. I don't think that's all that significant, and I don't expect that argument to win. But the other argument is much more significant, and it'll bring us back 20 years to when you and I were discussing Bush versus Gore. The question is, the United States Constitution says that for purposes of presidential elections, state legislatures get to set the manner for conducting those elections. And here's the state Supreme Court overruling the manner, say on the timing of when ballots have to be received, overruling the manner of conducting the election based on the state constitution. And the question is, does the state constitution trump the state legislature as a matter of federal law? It's a really complicated question. I'm not sure if anyone else besides Nassim and you and I or lawyers, would be used to such a crazy question, but here's why it's significant. It's significant because if there's any post-election contest, you can imagine, for example, Biden is asking for the court to extend deadlines so that there could be a full recount of votes, just like we saw in 2000 in Bush versus Gore. If the state Supreme Court says, yes, we're doing that under the state constitution, that might itself be unconstitutional. And what it would really do is rein in Democratic Supreme Courts that might ease post-election recount rules if a Republican legislature objected. That's and so that could apply in Michigan, in North Carolina, not Michigan. It could apply in North Carolina and Pennsylvania. I think are the only two states that have Republican legislatures and Democratic-dominated Supreme Courts.
Now, there was another case in Pennsylvania that seemed pretty significant a little while ago, where the legislature tried to say that drop boxes were improper, and a federal judge appointed by the first President Bush said that that was unconstitutional. Is that case still pending?
So I don't think you characterized it quite right. What happened is there was a federal court case and the state court case going at the same time. The federal court decided, I'm going to wait till the state court rules, so it did. And then once we understood what the state rules were, like drop boxes are allowed, then it wasn't the legislature, it was the Trump campaign that came in and said, hey, if you allow drop boxes, what you're going to be doing is you're going to be facilitating fraud. And the district court issued an opinion on this, in this case last week, and as a Trump appointee, 138-page thoughtful opinion that said that the Trump campaign has presented no credible evidence of fraud. And therefore, these attacks on the drop boxes should fail. That case has now been appealed to the Third Circuit. But this is a pattern that we're seeing around the country. When the argument is with the Republicans on offense rather than defense, the argument is you should stop this rollback that the state has done. You should stop this expansion of voting rights that the state has done in the midst of the pandemic because it will facilitate fraud. Every court that's seen that argument has rejected it. Republicans are much better in arguing it's too late to make the change, defer to the states, or in the case of Pennsylvania, as we'll see if they accept it, the state legislature's views have to trump the state constitution. But the claims that there's fraud to justify rolling this back. Those have been rejected in Nevada, in Pennsylvania, in Montana, in New Jersey. You know, the list goes on.
Great, thank you. Let's jump ahead to November 3rd and the days right afterward. There's a phrase that's gone around a lot this year that I think it's worthwhile for you to talk about, which is the phrase that's called the blue wave. And how does that affect this entire situation?
Do you mean the blue shift?
The blue, well, some people call it the blue shift, some people call it the blue wave.
Well, there's also the red mirage. We've got a lot of expressions here.
Go ahead.
All right, so let me talk about this. And let me back up a little bit and say that since we're in Orange County, and some of you might be in Katie Porter's district, you might remember that Katie Porter didn't win her election on election night. In fact, there were 7 races in Southern California where the Republican was ahead on election night. But as additional votes were counted by Neil Kelly, the registrar in Orange County, and some of these were in other Southern California counties, the margins of the Republican candidates kept shrinking. And eventually 7 Democrats won elections where they were behind on election night. And why did that happen? It's a phenomenon that political scientists have called the blue shift. The idea is Democrats tend to vote later, and their ballots, therefore, later as absentee voters. They tend to get their ballots at the last minute. So the late arriving ballots tend to be Democratic. And so the vote margins shift from being more Republican to being more Democratic. So this happened not just in California, it happened in Arizona. You may remember that in the McSally-Sinema US Senate race, McSally was winning on election night, but a week and a half later, Sinema was declared the winner. So that happens. Now, here's why it's much more significant this time around. First of all, when you think about mail-in balloting generally, there's not really a Democratic-Republican leaning on that. Like, they both do it about equally. But this election, at least the way what people are reporting, is many more Democrats are saying they're planning to vote by mail, and many more Republicans are saying they're planning to vote in person. So this could mean in a state like Pennsylvania, where they're not going to be like we do in California or like they're doing in Florida, they're not going to be processing those absentee ballots before election day. So in California or Florida, they'll be checking everything, make sure your signature matches, make sure your ballot is valid. They won't actually count the ballot until election day, but they'll get everything ready to go. And you can imagine a situation where in Pennsylvania, the in-person ballots, which are announced first, go to Trump. And Trump is in the lead. And then Trump says, as he's been saying, mail-in ballots are fraudulent. We should go with election night totals. And I've won the election. He declares victory. And then a week and a half later, Joe Biden is declared the winner of the election in Pennsylvania. And now there's a dispute because they think there was something done wrong, fraudulent about the counting, because the president has made, even tonight at his town hall, made completely unsupported statements about fraud in the election. And so it could create a crisis. It could also provide the predicate for, if it's close enough, for Republicans to go to court to try to stop the counting of certain mail-in ballots. That's why I'm hoping that the election is not close, whether it's Trump or Biden, someone has a clear victory. Because if it's really close and it comes down to Pennsylvania, we could have fighting over those ballots, and especially the delay that would come, and that period of 1 to 2 weeks after election day, where we might not be clear who the president is, but Trump could be declaring victory. And so that seems like given the kind of tension we've seen in the country, and given the polarization, that seems like it would be a very tough period for the United States.
The president has also urged his supporters to go out to the polls to try and prevent fraudulent voting. How much of an issue do you think it is with Trump's sort of self-appointed army, for lack of a better way of putting it, trying to stop people from voting? Is that a serious issue?
It's hard to know. So you can go to armyfortrump, I think, .com, I'm not sure, but Army for Trump is the literal name, as you said. It's not just and you could sign up to be a poll watcher. Now, here's what we know. We know 2 things. Number one, Trump said he was going to do this in 2016, and it didn't materialize. And in fact, the claims to sign up to be poll watchers was really, I think, an attempt to gather email addresses to solicit for campaign contributions. But this time around, things are somewhat different, and there are activities that are being done. to organize poll watching. Here's why things are really significant. In 1981, that's almost 40 years ago, there was a lawsuit that was brought by the Democratic National Committee against the Republican National Committee, claiming that Republicans were intimidating minority voters at polling places in New Jersey and elsewhere, including sending a so-called ballot security force, which were off-duty law enforcement officers with weapons and uniforms to polling places. And the Republican Party settled that lawsuit, and they signed a consent decree, and they said, we won't engage in this activity. And the consent decree kept getting extended, and it finally expired in 2017, and it's no longer in place. So this will be the first election in 40 years, almost 40 years, without this consent decree in place. So the Republican Party can engage in more of this activity. They say they're not going to do anything illegal. They're not going to intimidate voters. And I've looked at some of their training videos, and they seem very much by the board. Here's how you go in. Here's if you want to challenge a voter. You should remain silent. Don't talk directly to the voter. They're very organized and not over the top at all. But as you said, Trump has told his supporters, go watch them in their polling places. And I'm much more worried about vigilantes taking matters into their own hands, and not necessarily widespread problems of intimidation or violence, but pockets of it. And I think election administrators are looking out for that. They know that that's a potential problem that can happen, and they are trying to take whatever precautions they can so that we don't have any kind of intimidation of voters. We already had one incident in Fairfax County, Virginia. The rules that say no electioneering at the polling place apply only to the polling place in most states and not to the long line that might develop. And so there were some Trump supporters that were being very loud and trying to convince voters to vote for Trump on the line, and Democrats pointed to this as a form of intimidation. Not clear that it's intimidation, but certainly you might expect people to be kind of in your face if you're waiting on a long line to vote. Let me just say this so don't forget. My advice to everyone is vote as early as you can, whether that's in person or on election day. Whether that's in person or by mail, because we don't know what election day is going to look like. And especially if there are a lot of Republicans who are waiting till election day to turn out, the more we can alleviate the pressure, the more likely is those people will be able to vote and cast their ballots in as easy way as possible under the pandemic conditions.
So there's one more historical question I want to ask you about, and then one concluding question. As I think most of the people in the audience know, in 1965, Congress passed something called the Voting Rights Act. It was designed to basically put real teeth in the 15th Amendment, which gave African Americans the right to vote after many years of being disenfranchised after the Civil War. And then a lot of the Voting Rights Act seemed to have been gutted in 2013 in a decision called Shelby County versus Holder. How significant is that decision playing into what we're dealing with now?
Well, I think generally speaking, Shelby County versus Holder is a very important decision because it turned back this part of the Voting Rights Act that said that states with a history of discrimination in voting cannot make any changes in voting without showing that showing to the federal government that the change would not make minority voters worse off. I don't think that's really a lot of what's going on in this current election in terms of problems with voting rights, in part because, aside from some consolidations of polling places, remember who would have been approving any changes? It would have been the Trump Justice Department. So I think whatever changes would have been made would have been subject to a green light. So I don't think that Shelby County would have changed anything significant in this election. But I think generally speaking, it's made a significant change. So within a couple of hours of that decision, Texas reimposed its voter ID law that had been held by the courts. North Carolina passed the package of the strictest set of voting rules any state had passed in one swoop since the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. And generally speaking, especially in local areas, it's been easier to roll back gains that minority voters have made by making changes in restrictive voting rules. And the courts have not been very active in using other parts of the Voting Rights Act as a backstop to try to prevent that from happening. So I don't attribute the problems we have now to that, but I do think it's part of a broader social problem.
Okay. So I've asked you a lot of downbeat questions, but before taking questions from the audience, I want to ask you, sort of close with an upbeat question. So the election's less than 3 weeks away, and despite considerable impediments, nearly 18 million people already have voted, far more than this point in 2016. People interviewed in long lines in Georgia, Texas, North Carolina, and other states have waited up to 10 hours. All have told reporters that think it's absolutely crucial to vote this year. So my question to you, Rick, is do you think we're seeing a rekindling of the spirit of democracy? And if so, what do you think accounts for it?
Well, it's hard to know if what we're seeing is just votes shifting or that we're going to have higher vote totals. Before the pandemic hit, Michael McDonald, who tracks this information at the University of Florida, was predicting a tsunami of voting because we're highly polarized. Donald Trump is a polarizing figure. People love him or people hate him. And it's motivating people to vote. So I don't think we know yet whether we're going to have record turnout. It would not surprise me. Or if we just have people shifting. But the fact that people are willing to wait in these really long lines which I hope after the first few days will die down, I think is a testament to this. And I attribute a lot of it to Trump. If we had, this was the re-election of Jeb Bush running against, Kamala Harris, just like a kind of ordinary race. I don't know that we would have this level of turnout even during a pandemic, but I think we'll see. But in lots of ways, what the Trump presidency has done has been to challenge some of the norms about how the country is run, and that has been polarizing. And I think it's getting people who either want more of the same or want to stop this in their tracks to go out. Now, ordinarily, more participation is a great thing. And we want, I was just on a panel saying, why is voter turnout so low? I don't think it's that low, at least by historical standards. I think we're on our way up. But one of the things that I write about in Election Meltdown is about election legitimacy. And the question is, how do you hold a legitimate election when both sides think the other side is cheating? And it's even worse when people see this as an existential election. If Donald Trump is reelected, or if Donald Trump is not reelected, it's the end of this country as we know it. And that's where democracies can fall apart. That's where there's the danger of the democratic contract being broken, because people believe that this is going to profoundly change my way of life if we lose this election. And so I'm worried, and I love voters voting, but I hope that we can survive this very fraught moment.
Agreed. So that your response leads to the first question from the audience is, what do you view as the potential worst case scenario?
Oh. You want to know what keeps me up at night? A lot of things. I mentioned one, which was the Trump declares victory early and his supporters don't believe that the later vote totals are legitimate. One I talk about in the book is a cyber attack that takes out the power in a Democratic city in a swing state on election day. Imagine the power's out in Detroit. We don't have good rules for how to deal with that. All of a sudden, we've forgotten about cybersecurity, because there's so much news filling the air every day. But yet, that's a real threat. I worry about violence at the polling places, all the kinds of things that we talked about. But let me just put it in perspective and say, the title of my book is Election Meltdown. And I like to analogize myself to an engineer who works in a nuclear power plant, whose job it is to figure out all the ways the core can melt down and to try and stop it from happening, even if they're not likely. So Ben Ginsburg, who's a very eminent Republican election lawyer who just retired, said he thinks there's a less than 1% chance that we go into overtime. I don't know that I put it quite that low, but a 1% chance of a catastrophe is still something that would keep me up. And I mean, think about the mortality rate of COVID. It's only a few percentage points, and yet we're very concerned because the consequences can be so dire. And so there's a lot of things that worry me, but in perspective, I think the odds are we make it through. And part of what gives me a little bit more confidence than I had a few weeks ago is the polling. The polling is not showing that it's particularly close right now. If it's a Biden landslide, as it could be, I'm not predicting it's going to be, I'm out of that prediction business after 2016. But if it is, then I think we're in a position where it's more likely that the country survives, as opposed to a really close election that is fought in the Congress, in the state courts, in the legislatures, and in the streets.
Next question from a member of the audience is, any strong thoughts that you have about legislation that could, looking ahead, that could improve some of these problems?
Well, I actually want major legislation, which kind of on my wish list would be a constitutional amendment that would guarantee an affirmative right to vote, that would set up national nonpartisan election administration, kind of like the Federal Reserve, independent of the government, and that would make states have to comply with certain standards so that their voting technology and their ballot design, as you pointed to earlier, that these things were done in a competent way. And so certainly we need more money for that as well. I don't think that that is anything that's going to happen in the short term, but I think that it is a goal to strive towards. At the very least, I think centralizing things more at the state level and more federal cooperation and more resources. I mean, suppose the Democrats take the Senate and the House and the presidency and they try and pass election reform, which some have talked about them doing, and even blowing up the filibuster to do it. I wouldn't mind seeing something in that bill that requires states to provide a certain minimal level of competence when they're running elections.
Yeah, I will note that there's actually now an organization, a nonprofit organization, that is working toward having, as you said, an affirmative amendment to the Constitution about the right to vote. Next question is, do you think there's strong evidence that either Russia or China or any other country is meddling in the election?
There certainly is evidence that that Russia and China and Iran and some other countries have been spreading misinformation, and as we saw in 2016, trying to suppress the vote through negative stories. For example, we saw a number of fake black Twitter personas, which were actually being run out of Russia to try to convince people to stay home and don't vote for Joe Biden, just as was done in 2016. That said, and there was just a story today that the latest revelations about Hunter Biden that were printed in the New York Post, which came from Rudy Giuliani, that Giuliani might be, the White House was warned by security officials that Giuliani might be fed disinformation by Russian agents, and that's where he's getting his information. There has not been evidence that we've seen of any attempt to engage in cyber attacks against voter registration databases like we had in 2016. But we still have 19 days before the election, so not clear if that's still to come.
Thanks, Rick. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Karen.
Okay, thanks, guys. That was fascinating. And I don't think that I'm going to sleep any better after hearing that.
Yeah. You need to invite a different speaker next time.
And it's only 3 weeks away. That's really stunning, isn't it? In 3 weeks, we're going to see if we're going to have chaos or it's going to go well. Anyway, we so appreciate this. And thanks to Afsani and Nasim also for getting you guys to talk to us, because I know that you guys are hot right now.
Our pleasure.
So thank you, and thanks for everyone who participated. And we will see you next week, maybe Thursday, maybe Wednesday, with Elizabeth Loftus speaking.